Hello, I'm Henry Bonsu and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's got you talking on social media and beyond. Joining me today are the author and blogger Richard Phillips, Esther Stanford, a co-founder of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and the cultural critic Father Frank Gelly. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, since first contact with the British in the 18th century, the indigenous people of Australia have been brutalised and their numbers reduced by disease and a series of policies that almost wiped them out. Now the top police officer in Western Australia has delivered a landmark apology to Aboriginal people for their devastating treatment at the hands of law enforcement. This follows the historic national apology given in 2008 by then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and the establishment of a National Sorry Day 10 years earlier. But for all of this, there's been precious little improvement in the fortunes of native Australian people. They're still underrepresented in education and the workforce, and overrepresented in the mental health and criminal justice system. Their plight is remarkably similar to that of populations of colour living in Europe, the US and Latin America, whose ancestors were enslaved and colonised. Okay, reaction from the panel in a moment, but first let's listen to how Chris Dawson.
Some of the comments I'll be making shortly are confronting and may make some people feel uncomfortable. But I understand that truth-telling is an important part of enabling and facilitating change. And so today, on behalf of the Western Australian Police Force, I would like to say sorry to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for our participation in past wrongful actions that have caused immeasurable pain and suffering.
All right, so that's the Police Chief of Western Australia. I'm going to start off with our cleric, our moral person on the panel. Oh, you're all moral, of course, but I mean, Father Frank Gelly, you in particular. What did you make of that apology by Chris Dawson?
2 points. First, we have tragedy and we have comedy. Tragedy is the imperialistic and colonial invasion of Australia, the expropriation of native people, the massacres of native people, the stealing of their land, the reducing them to the status of subhumans and all that. That is the tragedy. And that is part of historical crimes of Britain, which often poses as a sort of model country, as a model nation, whereas of course there is the dark side of Britain.
Well, what about the apology?
I want to go on to a comedy, and that is the apology.
Okay.
The apologies, to me, belong more to a comedy than to the reality. Because how can I apologize? What do apologies actually obtain? What is the consequence of apologies? Is it just empty words, or what does it flow from it?
Well, he sounded very sincere and he was very, very specific about why he was apologising for what the law enforcement of Western Australia had done in perpetrating heinous policies.
It's too easy to apologise, to say words, edifying words, but what actually flows from those words is someone saying, okay, just forgive us, forget it all, and we're all chums, we're all together, Australians.
All right.
And incidentally, last but not least, are the apologies on behalf also of new Australians or Chinese, Indonesian, and so on, who have nothing to do with the crimes?
Well, he was very specifically talking about law enforcement. Esther, what do you make of the apology? Do you find it more valuable than Frank appears to?
No, actually I don't, because I'm working with Aboriginal activists who want a lot more than apology. Yep. They want their sovereignty back, and they argue that sovereignty never ceded. And the apology is very limited. It speaks more, I think, to the agency of the oppressor nation, rather than looking at the restoration of the victimised population.
But I mean, he was only able to speak for the position he holds. I mean, he's the chief
in terms of law
police,
enforcement,
so that's what he said, very specific.
Absolutely.
And it's a start, you might say.
Well, there's been many starts before that, going back to 1999 and much earlier. It's not enough. Aboriginal people had their homeland invaded. They still exist, and they want their sovereignty restored. And there are groups like the Sovereign Union of Australia, which is a coalition of sovereign nations who have reclaimed their sovereignty. And it is something that they are not going to stop organising and agitating to restore.
Okay, well, you want more than
They
just
want
an apology.
more.
No, I'm talking about in terms of the context of this programme. So does Frank. Clearly they do, and we'll come to that in a bit more detail later, Esther. But Richard, you're a frequent visitor to Australia. You know a lot of the people. You meet a lot of people when you're down there. How do you think it went down?
Well, I think probably looking at it, I mean, first of all, he was making an apology on behalf of the Western Australian Police
Force, yeah.
And obviously this is kind of fairly contemporary, activity.
Yeah.
Most of the wrongs done to, the fundamental ones done to us, to the Aboriginal population were, in the 100 years ago, end of the 19th century. And it's absolutely no question that there was a kind of horrendous kind of genocide that went on, and I think that is true. As to the problem is now, I think, as to what can be done about it, as far as the apologies go, generally apologising. I'm against the idea of apologising.
Yeah. All three of you are anti the apology. That's
not a bad apology. I'm against. No, I'm not. I think if you're apologising for something that is contemporary and for which you are responsible, or at least which you are connected to those who are responsible, I think that's a reasonable position to take.
Yeah, because
if
the pain cascades through the generations, as people say it does, then surely the responsibility cascades through the generations.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't feel responsible for things that my forebears have done. I do not, okay? I think to be apologising for something that I don't feel responsible for is absurd. A, it's absurd. B, it's completely hypocritical.
Hypocritical?
Yeah, I think it is. How can you possibly apologise for something for which you're not responsible?
It's symbolic. It's
no,
symbolic.
It isn't. It's,
so much of life is symbolic.
You must, if you're going to apologise, you must have some degree of contrition.
All right.
But if you don't feel, why should I feel contrition for something that's got nothing to do with me?
All right.
Or indeed,
okay, we're going to come to that. We're going to come to, I suppose, the ramifications of the apology and what may come from it a little bit later on. But first, none of you guys are an Australian. Maybe you don't feel the way a lot of Australians.
I once had an Australian girlfriend.
Okay, thank you, Frank. But that's not really relevant here. But our next guest is Australian. He's the academic Dr. Phil Clark, and he joins us via Skype now. Dr. Clark, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Now, the police chief said he was going to make some people feel uncomfortable. How did it make you feel as an Australian? Did it make you feel discomfort or something else?
I think fundamentally I felt a sense of relief that such a senior police officer in one of our most conservative states in Western Australia is making this very provocative statement. In many ways, I agree with many of the comments that the other panellists have made, but I think maybe what we're missing here is the very specific Australian context. Our police force right across the country has been institutionally negligent and I think forgetful and deliberately dismissive of any crimes committed against the Indigenous population at their own hands for more than 100 years now. So I think we have to recognise the significance of a very senior police officer coming out and saying institutionally the police force has this responsibility for these crimes that have been committed. But also I think one of the reasons why this interview has resonated so deeply right across Australia in the last few days is that it's happening in Western Australia, which has been one of our most racist states. The police force, the political establishment there has been virulently racist for as long as anybody can remember. And so to have the chief of police of that particular state come out and make this statement is very, very significant. Now, I agree that there needs to be a lot more now. The apology in and of itself is only a beginning.
Well, that's the thing, Phil. That's the thing, because, I mean, we've had this series of apologies, National Sorry Day, Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister's apology 10 years ago. I'm just wondering where it's leading if the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australian is not really closing, certainly not at the rate people hoped.
Look, Australia is starting from such a low point in terms of relations between the white settler population and the Indigenous population. I mean, I think this would be quite shocking to people around the world, just how poor relations between the white population and the Indigenous population actually are. And that's why even a statement like this from a police commissioner, which may seem sort of inconclusive and fundamentally unsatisfactory, to most outside viewers is in fact deeply significant in Australia at the moment. Now, the key will be what kind of practical consequences will this statement have? Are we, for example, going to see material reparations paid to any Indigenous victims of police brutality in the state of Western Australia? Are we going to see Indigenous representation at the federal level? Because that has been a hot button issue in the last 12 months, and the Indigenous population in Australia is fed up with being told these are not issues for now, these are issues for later. These are the kind of practical political consequences that are going to make a difference. The words are a beginning, but we have to go a lot further than the words.
I mean, there have been years of programs in place already, though, haven't there, for Aboriginal welfare integration, trying to accelerate people through the public sector, as you've seen in New Zealand and attempts at it in Canada and elsewhere. But why has there been so little progress in Australia?
There are lots of reasons for that, but I think the major reason is that this has never been a priority for everyday white Australians. And I think that's what needs to change. The pressure needs to come from the electorate on our politicians to really take issues of Indigenous welfare, but also redress for past crimes very seriously.
So are we talking some form of reparations? Are we talking something financial?
I think it would need to be comprehensive. So I think that there undoubtedly does need to be financial reparation to individual victims of, for example, police brutality. But reparations also will need to be structural. This involves issues around land, titleship. That is an enormous issue in Australian politics at the moment, and we haven't done enough in the past to address Indigenous land ownership claims. But also this is political. This is about increasing Indigenous representation at the level of federal politics so that it's not only white politicians making decisions on behalf of the Indigenous population, it's Indigenous Australians having a direct say in the way that policies about Indigenous Australians are in fact enacted. So this issue of redress, this issue of reparations really has to be comprehensive at multiple levels.
Dr. Phil Clark, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Very instructive there, and that's an Australian, an academic who knows a lot about his country. He didn't seem to dismiss the apology by the police chief, Richard. He felt there was some value, but of course more needs to be done.
Well, I don't dismiss the police chief, but I think that's an entirely different thing, because he is a policeman. He's talking about police activities, and presumably fairly recent ones. So I think there's, I get that. And if he's apologising for something, that's happened during his time in the police, fine, and for which he feels responsible. It's the point of apologising for things for which you are not directly responsible. Now, I think you might argue that most of the crimes committed against, the genocide against the Aboriginal population, of Australia, were committed by, actually, it was time of the British. It was part of the British Empire. There were Britons who were going out to Australia. Australians, the descendants of modern Australia, are entirely different.
But it's been an independent country for quite some time now, has it not? And of course, the stolen generation and all of that happened, much of it, in the 20th century.
Yes,
within the current lifetime.
The principal, crimes in terms of the actual wiping out of Australia, Aboriginals in Tasmania and other places, took place when it was part of our empire. And, what does that have to do with Australian descendants for, the Chinese or Japanese or Czechs or Greeks or Italians or Irish, all of whom came there?
Esther's desperate to get in.
I think that's a bit of a red herring, because the issue is not about new communities who've just settled in Australia. It is really about the white settler community. And I disagree that the most damage was done a long time ago. In fact, Aboriginal people, Indigenous peoples of Australia, argue that they are still experiencing genocide. And the 1948 definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention makes it very clear that genocide is not just wiping out and exterminating a whole people. People can be surviving and still experiencing genocide.
How?
And they are, well, you go and look it up. I'm not here to teach you.
I'm just you just said something which makes no sense to me. So what do you mean?
I didn't phrase that. I didn't actually come up with a convention.
Can't you tell me what it says?
It talks about forcibly removing children from the group to another group. That is what has been part of the apology for the stolen generations. Yeah. It talks about imposing conditions of life on a group designed to prevent birth. That is happening. Right. So cultural genocide...
That is happening?
Yes, it is happening.
Okay.
I suggest you get a bit more educated from the Aboriginal people, and I'm quite disturbed, and I have to say this, that there hasn't been Aboriginal representation. I feel quite uncomfortable about that, because it's really important for the people themselves to speak for themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We'll be able to pick up in just a moment or two. But Australians are not the only ones who've made some form of apology for slavery or colonialism. In June this year, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, through which 40% of all enslaved Africans entered North America, apologised for its role in this appalling business. While some former imperial powers like France and Britain have made individual gestures, others like Belgium and the Netherlands have refused, claiming they were covered by the collective statement of regret by European countries at a Durban race conference in 2001. And I was wondering what we should make of the varying responses to demands for apology, because of course so you get the Belgians, you know, and the Dutch saying you can't lay that on our door. You know, this is 21st century. We've moved on now. But other countries making historic statements of regret, like Tony Blair did on behalf of the British government in 2006. Frank,
the key question is a question of justice. St. Augustine asked, "What are great empires but bands of robbers?" Now, a robber is someone who comes into your home and steals your property. And that was what has happened to the indigenous people of Australia. The land, their very land has been stolen. Now, I do warm to Esther's previous point, about the question of sovereignty. Because black South Africans have got their country back. The Aboriginals have not got their land back.
We haven't got the country back. That's why they're calling for land expropriation without compensation. We never got sovereignty back in Africa. That's why there's a reparations movement for African people.
But staying with Australia, the question is, when the Aboriginals get full justice, when they get their country back. I'm not saying the white Australians toddle off to where they came from, but what I'm saying is they should get their own state, they should get their own polity organised and subsidised and paid for, because that is what justice
is. That possible now in a country in which out of 20-something million, first Australians, Indigenous Australians, represent only 3% of the population?
But about 3%, there's quite a few. They could have a little small state. It would be a beginning. It would be a beginning. I think sovereignty, as Esther pointed out, is a key point.
Richard?
I think first of all, it's less than that, Henry, but you might be right. But in fact, I think, you know, in Australia, if you're 1/16 Aboriginal, you can claim Aboriginal ancestry.
Or something, yeah.
Literally, and in terms of, I think the problem is that the idea, I don't know about the territorial thing. I can see that there are more problems involved in that, you know, in terms of, as Frank suggested, designating a state. Where's it going to be? What are you going to create? Some kind of Bantustan, as they were once called in South Africa. It doesn't seem a great idea to me.
That was under Aegis, South African Aegis. I'm saying a state which really duly belongs to them.
Well, they want their own state back, actually. The country's there.
So what are you going to...
The settlers need to recognise that they are not the rightful inheritors of that land.
Right. It isn't going...
Who says it's not going to happen?
Well, are you telling me that 130,000 people are going to prevail over 30 million?
Well, the thing is that the days of the existing settler regime are numbered.
The current government of Australia?
Absolutely, because the people, and it's indigenous peoples all over. African peoples, Asian peoples are rising up to reclaim their sovereignty. And the minority who has dispossessed the majority will no longer continue to be able to do so.
There's an awful lot of heat.
So it's just something that we need to accept.
There's an awful lot of heat in the studio. Let's see if it's reflected out there on social media. Let's have a look at what you've been saying about this. Starting with Twitter, first of all, this from Trent. Racism is common and casual in Australia. When combined with police power, it's overt and palpable. Then Calvin says, this apology is one example of a law enforcement institution taking steps to heal while striving to protect and serve all peoples. Way to go, Western Australia. Blessings. And then on Facebook, we have this from Matt, who says, apologies are great, but actions to ensure this doesn't continue would be more appropriate as a step forward. And finally, this from Jake. Sure, it may bring some healing, but it can often fire up narratives of resentment. Sorry, it can't address the core reasons many Indigenous people come into contact with the police and the court system in the first place. Now remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram by using the handle DoublingDownTV. So, apologies are one thing, but if they led to reparations, what would these look like? Well, there is, of course, as we mentioned, money. Germany has paid billions to Israel for the mass murder of Jews by the Nazis and continues to compensate Holocaust survivors living in Eastern Europe. Then there's American-style affirmative action launched in the 60s, which provided quotas for African-American employment in construction. But Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and Chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, says in the Caribbean, things go so much deeper.
About the eradication of illiteracy, bad health, bad housing in the societies that have been ravished by slavery. I have said to the British Prime Minister and to the British government in their own parliament, you have left the Caribbean world in a royal mess. You have left the Caribbean world in a royal mess. Come back and help us to clean up that mess that you have created. That is what reparatory justice is about.
That was Professor Sir Hilary Beckles speaking at Harvard University a couple of years ago. So Esther, we know what his objectives are, Sir Hilary Beckles, in a very, very senior position in the reparations movement. But how do you think they should actually be designed? Because he says you've got to clear up the mess. But how would you see that being designed?
That is the CARICOM 10-point plan. And it's important to note that the movement for reparatory justice, the international social movement for African reparations, began from the time the first Africans were kidnapped on the shores of Africa. So there are other plans. And in fact, in the UK, we organise with a global perspective on reparations that includes the African case, including people of African heritage and ancestry in the Caribbean and other places where we were basically trafficked. But it also includes working with other reparations movements and struggles. And by the way, we have an annual reparations march on the 1st of August where Aboriginal communities will also be represented in our non-African allies bloc. So the voices of the peoples, which are about a reassertion of our sovereignty. It's not about cleaning up these neo-colonial Bantustans that were always designed to serve imperial Europe and in particular Britain. And if we're looking at the strategic goal of the International Social Movement for African Reparations, it is about the re-establishment of a sovereign nation state. And it's not the African Union that is 70% funded by non-Africans. It is a new state that incorporates Africa and her diaspora that we refer to as Ma'at Ubuntu Man. And that is an African conceptualization of a pan-African superstate and union of communities that will coexist with other members of the human family.
All right.
That is the strategic goal.
Frank, is this something you can get behind, having heard about it? And
oh, I think it goes back to justice, it goes back to a righteous wrath. Righteous wrath, as God's wrath at these appalling injustices, which must be, if they cannot be totally repaired, at least some action must be taken. I totally agree with Esther. There should be a question of sovereignty which cannot be dodged.
I get a sense, Richard, you don't feel that.
Well, I'm interested in this. Is this new African state going to supersede all the existing African states? Are they going to be dissolved?
Well, actually, those borders that exist are part of the harm, which we refer to as the Maangamizi, a Swahili term for African Holocaust. And yes, because indigenous African ethnicities and nationalities transcend those neo-colonial states.
So it's one super African state?
Well, I don't have to disclose here and now what that will look like, but at the end of the day, the people on the ground are working on that. We're already organising to resist these borders.
Can it be done without very serious financial support, call it what you like, from those who were running imperial empires. They would have to give money, would they not?
Well, the thing is, the first thing is that we say is that there must be a stopping of the hemorrhaging.
Right.
So a stopping of the extractivism, a stopping of the stealing of the resources of Africa.
The capital flight.
Exactly,
yeah.
Capital flight. There's been reports by War on Want, Britain's new colonialism, that speaks about 101 companies that control over 1 trillion worth of our mineral resources in Africa. We need to stop that extraction. Those resources will go, first of all, towards developing our people, and then it's about reclaiming everything else that we're entitled to.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Wow. And that's it for this week. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Father Frank Gelly, Esther Stanford and Richard Phillips. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, do check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.